Welcome to the Finance Forum with myself, Abdu-Raof Hanslo, and this is a special edition on the review of the budget speech made on Wednesday the 22nd of February. Now, a lot can be said about what our Minister of Finance, Mr. Praveen Gordhan, said from the podium on that day, but the main ethos and the main subject of the budget this year, as pointed out by the Minister, was transformation and economic development. Whether he achieved his goal of implementing that ethos, that remains to be seen. But today I have a special guest in studio, the portfolio manager from Element Investment Managers, Mr. Shamir Khan, who's going to unpack basically what was said during the budget speech and how it affects us as consumers. Assalamu alaikum to you, Shamir.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Abdu-Raof. Always a pleasure to sit with you.
You know, when we have people like yourself sitting in the seat opposite us, we dress very special. So, because the amount of knowledge and education that our consumer and our viewers can earn from a program like this is insurmountable. Ultimately, overall, the difficult question I'm going to ask is, was it a good or bad budget that was delivered on the 22nd?
Okay, so the word I would use is pragmatic, which basically means that you're dealing with the situation realistically as opposed to theoretically. So from that perspective, I think it was a good budget. But for the consumer, generally, we are still in the belt tightening mode. So I would say more bad than good.
Okay, now to start off with the bad, obviously, there was a lot said that can affect our pockets as consumers, and there was also a lot of stones thrown during the budget.
Sure.
And then also we had this type of a sort of a dark era, aura around the minister as he was standing on the podium. Unlike other years,
yes.
You know, a lot of promises were made in the previous years, and as we, in speaking to one of the opposition parties from the Freedom Front, we found out, well, it was commented that a lot of promises were made in the past, but was not implemented. And yet again, they say that a few promises were made, but whether it's going to be implemented or not, that's the big question. But the minister said a tremendous amount from that podium. And one of the key factors, I think, on everyone's minds, and there was a lot of talk around it prior to the budget, was the fact that for him to mitigate the economic downturn that we currently find ourselves in, the best way he could have done it was to raise VAT. He didn't touch VAT, obviously, but he touched on other tax perspectives. Maybe you can take us through that.
Yeah. So to come back to my original term, which was pragmatic. So in theory, the best way would have been to raise VAT, because VAT is a very wide-ranging tax, and it affects the entire population. So it's relatively easy to collect as well. So that would have, in theory, made more sense. However, generally, VAT is seen as a tax on the poor. Notwithstanding the fact that some food items are zero VATed, it's still considered a tax on the poor. So in order for him to deal with the realistic situation we find ourselves, both from an economic point of view, but more so from a political point of view, he had to target the top end of the income tax bracket. And that's where he started, and then he sort of worked his way through.
Now, the one thing that came out quite early in his speech was that it was a major concern to him, and obviously it was on his mind because throughout the budget he mentioned it, and that was that unemployment is at an all-time high in South Africa at the moment. I think, in my opinion, he tried to mitigate that by implementing various different things in order to stimulate employment in South Africa. In your opinion, has he done enough to increase employment, to the employment numbers?
So generally, if you look at studies worldwide, one of the biggest sort of employers tend to be entrepreneurs. And I think when you speak to entrepreneurs, their concern is still around the sort of red tape to actually get something started and then to maintain it. And then also flexibility of labor laws tend to play quite a big role in that. So if you look at the US, they have a very strong entrepreneurial culture, but one of the things that helps the entrepreneur there is the flexibility with respect to the labor force. Now that is quite a contentious issue in South Africa specifically, given our strong sort of union movement, but that is something that needs to be re-looked at. So he did talk about increasing the minimum wage. That might be a positive for the people who are currently employed, but it might make it more difficult for somebody who's seeking employment to actually get employment, because the cost of employing them does increase.
Now, I know that he mentioned that the worst figures for employment that came out during this last year was mining, the mining industry. He also spoke about the best figures, who employed the most. There's obviously been a tremendous amount of labor unrest in the mining industry. Do we see, or do we foresee that stabilizing in the near future?
Well, I think we would hope so, because it obviously makes it easier for foreign investment to come in. But if you look worldwide, the trend with respect to mining is what they call mechanized mining.
Yeah.
So what happens, whereas a mine previously had a labor force of, let's say, 10,000, that labor force now is effectively replaced by machinery, and it falls down to, let's say, between 2,000 and 3,000. So that is the big risk to the lowly skilled miner. So if you're a very highly skilled miner, yes, there will still be a place for you, but I think by and large the risk with respect to significant unrest from labor in mining is that the capital decision then gets made and they effectively get replaced by machines.
Now you mentioned about the global market. You mentioned America earlier on, the US. What was mentioned as well in the speech was that, in his opinion, that the global markets are now in a sort of a recovery mode, in the sense that he's expecting ideal growth from international markets. Obviously, the US is a different animal, but he put a lot of emphasis on China as well, and where the Chinese labor force, as well as India, where they might be situated going forward. In your opinion, from an investment perspective, are the global markets in recovery, and are there prospects currently in the global markets?
Yeah. So I think if you look at global markets, and let's talk about the GDP or the economic growth, generally it seems that we have plateaued, but there is still a risk that we go a bit more negative. Remember, Brexit was a shock to the system, and the shock was felt more in the stock markets, but we haven't really seen that filter through into the general economy. So you haven't seen companies leave London as a headquarters and then sort of move either to Berlin or Paris, etc. So the economy hasn't really adjusted to that. So I would say at best we are close to a plateau, and then hopefully the next move is upwards. I think in terms, I mean, you did mention America. So America, typically when you see significant growth there, it tends to sort of flow over to the rest of the world. The risk now with the current regime is that it's very inward looking. So that growth would be great for America, but not so great for the world. So if America's GDP does well, or the economy does well, they should be importing more. But if their policy is to revive their internal manufacturing, they're actually going to import less. So that would actually be to the detriment of other countries.
Now, there's increases across the board as well, as that would impact on the consumer. And the minister couldn't have said it better. When he took a sip of the water, he said, "It's not. Don't worry, it's not liquor, because he can't afford it anymore. It's too expensive." But on the sin tax, basically, he's increased the sin tax 6 to 10%, which was expected. But then also, I mean, prior to the budget speech, there was a huge call for no increases in the fuel levy and the road accident fund. Yet we saw a 30 cents increase in the fuel levy and a 9 cents increase in the road accident fund. Is this a good thing, and is this something that was expected, and is it justified in raising those levies?
Yeah. So the fuel levy is seen as another easy sort of win for them. A road accident fund, a bit more debatable.
Yeah.
But the impact to the consumer is obviously an increase in transport costs. Now, the difficulty with the increase in transport costs is that it filters through to everything.
Yeah.
Because whether it is the transport of food or coal or etc., that is where those costs increase, and then those costs have to be passed on to the consumer. So you feel it in two ways. One is the direct, your petrol price increases, but also indirectly, everything that where transport forms a part of the cost base has to increase as well.
Now going off the topic slightly there, when speaking about fuel increases, I know that there's news, the AA has already put out news that the possibility of quite a substantial jump in petrol pricing in come the 1st of March. And considering that our rand has strengthened and oil has gone up, but it hasn't jumped dramatically. And I know that there's a formula they use to work out the price. But in saying all that, he's expecting the global markets to perform, which means that oil would probably better its price, which means that in the future we might see an increase in petrol even further down the line. So to increase these levies basically just adds to that cost out of one's pocket when refueling the vehicle. So when taking that into consideration, easy looking ahead and planning correctly as far as inflation is concerned, from an inflation point of view, when looking at raising these levies.
I think that's two very good points you made there. One is inflation, and we'll unpack that later. But the other one is also, by increasing the fuel levy, you're increasing the fixed cost. So irrespective of what happens to the oil price or the rand, your price of petrol goes up, all things staying equal.
Yeah.
We have benefited from a strengthening rand. It doesn't feel like it, but the rand now is trading below 13, and it's come from sort of above 15 about 6 to 12 months ago. The oil price has increased, but not that significantly, from 50 to 56 US dollars a barrel. The good point you make there is, if the global economy does pick up, typically oil prices increase. And if you're not allowed to export that much more into the rest of the world, your rand would probably not strengthen. So you'd have that risk. So all in all, a strengthening economy globally doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you. The risk is that you have higher fuel prices, and that filter through to all those prices. Now, as those other prices increase, so you have fuel and transport increasing, and then food prices, so inflation comes under pressure. Now remember, why is inflation important? Why? Because the prices you pay at the till would increase. But secondly, it would mean that the government had to look at interest rates. Because the only way, or one of the ways to control inflation, a very blunt instrument, is to increase interest rates. So we haven't spoken about that, or the government hasn't really mentioned that, but that is always a risk. So I think the point to make here is that these factors are like a deck of dominoes. Once you topple one, there's always something else falling over. So, and that's the issue, is that increasing fuel has a secondary impact on food prices, and then potentially a third impact on increased interest costs.
Okay. Now, when we were speaking about cost on one's income as well, so the minister indicated that the high-end earners, basically if you're earning 1.5 million rand and above, your tax is now going to be 45% flat. So that, to me, when listening to it, when hearing him say that, says to me that the minister's targeting the wealthy in order to sustain the poor. But that's not actually what he's saying, is it, Shamika?
No. So, I mean, obviously, as the headline was that we're introducing this new tax bracket, 45% for the wealthy above 1.5 million. But what he failed to mention is that tax, what they call bracket creep. So, effectively, if you are paying tax this year or the last financial year, the next financial year you're going to be paying more tax because of what sort of the way they change the brackets within the tax structure. So personal income tax across the board is going to increase. In prior years we saw that they tended to give relief for the bottom end. There doesn't appear to be that much relief at the bottom end this time around. So yes, he mentioned the very rich, but also don't think that you're not going to be affected.
You know, we watched the faces of people when he said that, and I saw a lot of smiles. But then as the speech went on, and I saw discussion starting, I think people realized, but that's not where it ends.
No.
So very quickly that smile turned to a frown,
Yes.
In saying that, okay, fine, it's not only them that's going to be affected, it's
Yes.
everyone. So yeah, that only makes up a small percentage of our population, anyway, 1.5
Yes,
1.5
but
million.
yeah, as we mentioned, you know, from a political standpoint, it sent a good message, in inverted commas, as opposed to, say, increasing the VAT rate.
45% is almost half your salary. That's gone.
Yeah.
So at least we're getting something from the high earners.
Yes.
The other thing that he mentioned, and where this is very well expected, I mean, he does it every year, and that is on the liquor and tobacco, is increased by 6 to 10%. That's from a health perspective, probably. It makes sense, and basically it's a syntax, it's a luxury. So I think he was curbing most of the ministers as well when he said that. So yeah.
Yes, that's definitely a luxury. I mean, in terms of the health, the one to mention there is the potential sugar tax to come. They haven't really put it into or promulgated it yet, but I think the feeling is that it is going to happen. But that will also impact your food bill if you do consume a lot of carbonated soft drinks or juices, or even what they call cordials, which is the mixes.
So it's not only going to be the company. I mean, if the company sees a deficit due to additional taxation, they're going to filter that through to their sales. So yeah. The other thing also mentioned under that same bracket was carbon tax.
Yes.
So this is something that's been implemented around the world before, and now it's reached South Africa's shores, probably in the next year. Could you take us through that, Shamik?
Yeah, so initially when you talk about carbon tax, you as the consumer thinks, well, I don't think there's a direct impact to me. But carbon tax effectively just wants to tax emissions. And one of the biggest emitters of carbon taxes are coal-fired power plants. So most of our electricity comes still from coal. So if you implement a carbon tax, it means that your electricity price should go up. And that's notwithstanding any sort of load shedding, etc. So I think that's where the impact comes. So originally you might think it doesn't impact you, but understand that there are always secondary and sort of third level impacts coming through.
Then the other thing, obviously, that he does mention, and this is something that affects us directly every year when it comes to now, the 28th of February, when we close our books for the year, and the tax return season opens, and we apply for our tax returns. The two things that normally stand out is our medical exemptions and our retirement contributions. He mentioned that he's going to increase the medical exemptions for this year, medical expense exemptions for this year. But then he also mentioned something very interesting, and he said that don't get used to it because it's going to fall away. And this is because of the national health insurance being implemented. And there also he mentioned that the fund has been established now for this year, where the national health insurance fund would be implemented. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Shamik?
So national health, by and large, is a good thing. The difficulty always comes, like anything else, is funding it. So when you have such a big, expansive program, there tends to be a lot of inefficiencies. If you look just worldwide at, say, even the UK, so people look at the UK and say, well, that's a great system. But people there will tell you that there is a lot of inefficiency in the system. So when you have a lot of inefficiency, it means that you have to fund a lot of excessive expenditure. Now, the question is, where does that funding come from? And as you know, we are in what we call a budget deficit, i.e., we have less income than expenses.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that he could do it is to reduce or even remove the medical aid tax exemption / subsidy. So that is going to hurt some people. Now, some people might say, well, it doesn't really affect me because I'm not on medical aid. I go to normal provincial or local healthcare. That is fine. But understand that funding has to come from somewhere. There is only a set pool of people in the country. So by hook or by crook, they have to get the funding.
Yeah, then he's given a lot of advice in his speech as well, and I think one of the advices was for homeowners, current homeowners, to basically hold on to their properties because that would be equity in the future, which I think was very noble of him, giving advice from the podium. Yes, but then now we come to that part basically where we've now explored the doom and gloom. Then there's the neutral part before we get to the positives of it. And I think the neutral part, basically, he spoke about fees of universities. He basically said fees will not increase for 2017. That in itself seems good, but that's not exactly what the current learners want to hear.
No. So, I mean, it's difficult to say that it's the majority of current learners, but definitely the more vociferous part of the learners. Obviously, they have the hashtag fees must fall. So, fall and staying the same, there's a bit of a expectation gap in between. So, I think the risk is that we might see similar situation to what we saw last year. And by and large, if they don't achieve a declining fee structure, it does mean that they effectively hurt themselves, because obviously their study program does get put back 6 months, a year. The point to make is, if fees does fall or decrease, where do you get the extra funding? And once again, if you're trying to fund an increased social program via social grants and an NHI, it's also difficult to see where you're going to find all the funding for a free tertiary education. You might say, well, a lot of money is wasted on various other government expenditure, and that might be, but then you would have to seriously look at it. I think the problem South Africa faces is we don't have a significant, let's say, what in developed worlds called the whole budget. So our defense force, we do have a defense force, but it's not anything on the scale as a percentage of GDP as what you see in the rest of the developed world. Because that would be an easy win to say, let's scale that back and put it more into socialist. But we don't.
We passed the defense budget already, so in previous presidencies. So but I think the one thing he did allude to, he said he wants to encourage the private sector on bursaries and to fund education from their perspective. So I think there also he's looking at routes to basically mitigate
and I think if you allow so nobody does anything for free, inverted commas. So if there are tax incentives, etc., they will do it. I mean, one of the banks being Barclays Africa, they mentioned they're sponsoring 3,000 university students. It's costing them 210 million rand. That's because it's roughly 70,000 rand a student. So those are big numbers, and they are difficult for the man in the street to get to.
Shamir, now coming to the good news of what Minister Gordon had to say. I think the one on the top of my list is where I don't think anyone gives you 150,000 rand for nothing. So he's increased the first-time home buyers the exemption on the transfer duty
Yes.
from 750,000 to 900,000. So is that expected to rise in coming years? And
Yeah, I think, I mean, as he tries to, as you mentioned, he tried to encourage home ownership as a form of saving. One of the problems South Africa has, and is generally emerging markets, besides maybe, I don't know, maybe India, is we don't have a big saving culture. So it's a question of how do we encourage that. What they found, and they haven't mentioned it in terms of retirement legislation, but what they found is when a person does retire and he gets his payout, he tends to spend that as opposed to invest that. So they're trying to encourage more of a saving and investment culture. And you also saw that they increased the tax-free savings amount from 30,000 to 33,000. So they're just trying to say, try and take care of your future, because yes, the government is there to try and increase your pension, but by no stretch of the imagination is it going to cover all your needs.
now that's very interesting, because as you earlier said, we South Africans don't have a savings culture. So by increasing the tax-free savings by 10%, basically he's stimulating savings. So he's giving an option.
Yes, he's trying to.
Also, I mean, he's trying to take in my opinion, he's trying to take the burden off the government.
Yes.
So by saving in that way in future, when it comes to retirement, at least you'll have something to depend on instead of just the state. The other good thing that he spoke about as well is the allocation of additional 240 billion rand towards education, South Africa. And I think that more or less is in line with his ethos of the budget transformation and economic development. Under the transformation part, obviously, he's looking at equality. So he's looking at equalizing the workspace, equalizing education, equalizing everything. And that 240 billion rand, which seems like a lot of money to us, but if you look at the amount of learners that has to cover, then it doesn't really work out to that much.
So, I mean, any amount is obviously very helpful. And it is important to increase the education levels of a nation, because that typically translates into a wealthier nation. But part of that wealthier nation is that as graduates, or as people graduate, there also needs to be an environment where they can enter a workforce and not have to struggle. So it's fine to educate them, but you also have to provide incentives for people to employ them. And what we've seen recently is that universities themselves are trying to upskill their students. So previously a university student had lots of theory and no practical implications. Now they're also trying to provide some practical nuances to the student, to the university student.
So the other good news as well is he's increased the social grants. In my opinion, it's just below inflation. Above inflation. Just above inflation. So he's increased the social grants, and then he's put a tiered system in place by the looks of it. He said over the age of 65, 90 rand increase to 1,600 rand.
That's it.
And over the age of 75, there's an additional 20 rand added to that, so it's 1,620. He's also looked at the children's grants and the disability grants, which is also increased. So that's some good news and a reprieve for our aged living off the state.
Definitely, I think, when you increase social grants for the aged, there is definitely a positive impact, and especially in South Africa, where you have the grandmother and the grandfather also supporting other members of the family. Similar with disability, that also tends to have a positive impact. The questionable impact is generally around child grants. So if you look at the US, what they found is that if child grants reach a certain level, it actually encourages people to have children, as opposed to it serving its purpose, which is to help people with children. So that is something that I think the government needs to be quite cognizant of and keep quite a beady eye on.
And I think lastly, the last point that is very important, and I think the president also alluded to this, was that they are going to increase in 2018 the minimum wage,
Yes.
and that raises up to 20 rand. And I think it's from 17 rand 50 or somewhere around there. So that too is an encouragement for employment, but on the other hand, also it has its downfalls for the employer.
Yes. So, I mean, I think it is quite positive that people have to earn a living wage.
Yeah.
And also, once again, in South Africa, there's always a family to support. So I think 20 rand an hour, we're all behind that. I think the one risk in the short term as people adjust is that the person might earn the same amount in terms of number of rands, but they might work fewer hours. So if you have a domestic, whereas taking it 5 days a week, you might end up taking it 4 days a week. And I think over time that will adjust, but I think in the short term that is probably the one negative around it. But generally I think it is positive from a long-term perspective.
And then basically the ethos and the aura surrounding this budget. I mean, he made a very bold statement, and I quote him, he says, if lions work as a team, they can bring down even a buffalo. And I almost think that he was throwing stones, and there was a lot of those types of things said during the budget. So
those innuendos.
So we don't really know what's going on from a political perspective and political wrangling within the hierarchy of government. But the one thing that many of the media houses are reporting is that there's a new kid on the block that was inducted to Parliament on Thursday the 23rd of February, and that was Brian Molefe, the ex-head of Eskom. And there's a huge rumor stating that he might take over the position of Finance Ministry. Now that's a rumor. We're not going to go into that ultimately, but I think I just have one question for you. We saw what happened in Nenegate in 2015. If something like that happens with Mr. Praveen Gordhan, what do you expect of our economy?
Well, I think there is an expectation that he's going to be replaced. So I think it's not as much a shock as what Nene was a complete shock. No one expected it. I think what is more important, there's two dates to watch out for. End of March, the SARB is going to sit for the interest rates. And then around May, June, the S&P is going to do another rating on South Africa. And I think by and large, people expect a rating downgrade. So that should cause the rand to come under some pressure. Another factor that might also come into play is in this budget, there was no mention about nuclear power. So, you know, given Mr. Molefe's background, Eskom, if he were made finance minister and there's increased talk about nuclear power, I think that would have a more negative impact, because it would mean significant imports into South Africa, and those are all tend to be dollar based, so that would impact the rand.
So it looks like the appointment is totally political.
We don't know.
But Shamir, thank you very much for your time. I think we've covered a tremendous amount, and I think we've basically put together a good review of exactly what the budget was all about on the 22nd.
Thank you.
You've been watching the Finance Forum with myself, Abdu-Raof Hanslo, and my special guest in studio, Mr. Shamir Khan, the portfolio manager of Element Investment Managers, and we gave you an in-depth view and review of Budget 2017. Until next time, stay focused to your finances.